Hey, Marlins fans, welcome to a new edition of Big Fish Small Pod for Friday, May 31st. It's the final audio recording of the month of May here on the Fish on First podcast channel presented by MPT College Consulting. On Thursday's off day, the Marlins made a trade, and it was the unique sort of deal where the acquisition itself didn't get a whole lot of attention or love. More so the corresponding move in order to bring in the new player to the Marlins organization. I'm going to do a quick summary of what happened here and why ultimately not a very big deal for the Marlins. Nothing to be too upset about. Quickly on the new guy, right-hander Shaun Anderson acquired for cash considerations, coincidentally coming from the Texas Rangers, the same Rangers that are in town in Miami this weekend to play the Marlins. Anderson was DFA'd by the Rangers a few days ago, the prototypical journeyman, where he's appeared in parts of 6 major league seasons with 6 different MLB organizations. And he's had some reps as a reliever, he's had some reps as a starter, and ultimately just not very good. A 5.83 ERA in his career. Gives a lot of hits and just despite a relatively deep pitch mix, quality of those pitches don't exactly stand out. This year, he'd spent more time in AAA than he had in the majors, and he had quite a bit of success as a starter in AAA in the Rangers organization. Perhaps that is why the Marlins felt it was worth taking a flyer on him. Cash considerations is just a small step up from a typical waiver claim, but shows you that multiple teams were interested in claiming Anderson with the Marlins. He's using his final minor league option this year, going down to AAA Jacksonville until further notice. Well, I'll be curious to see exactly what role they use him with down there, but he's on the 40-man roster, and he's somebody that I think you could see up before the end of the year when the situation presents itself. To get him onto the 40-man, they had a few candidates that they could have designated for assignment themselves without having any fear of losing, and I have to admit that it was not on my radar that potentially Woo-Suk Go would be the one that goes from that 40-man. The same Woo-Suk Go who was acquired in the Luis Arraez trade, one of the 4 players in that deal. He was not a critical piece of that package. I think as an outlet, we did a fairly good job of making it clear that he was the 4th piece of that package, behind Dylan Head, behind Jacob Marcy, behind Nathan Martorella, behind the actual hitting prospects that have since moved on to the Marlins top prospect list. Go was behind them. I think what perhaps we failed to articulate is that he wasn't really a player piece of this equation. He was more so just a financial element of it, a negative deal, a liability, a bad contract that was included really for no other purpose other than to balance the finances here. You may remember in the Arraez deal that the Marlins, they did their best to get what they thought was the best prospect return by paying down almost everything that Arraez was owed for the rest of this year. The Padres only owe Arraez a prorated portion of the league minimum for the rest of 2024, with the Marlins taking responsibility for everything else. And for the total this year, that was $10.6 million. They're going to end up paying right around $10 million to Arraez to play against them, as he just did these past few days. And by doing that, that unlocked, they believe, a better prospect return. That because they were covering the money there and leaving flexibility open for the Padres to make additional acquisitions as the season went on, that otherwise the Padres would not have been willing to include that trio of prospects, or at least not 3 of that caliber, in order to make this trade go through. And yet, apparently, eating all that money from Arraez was not quite enough to get the prospects that they did. And that another part of the equation was taking on the money that was owed to Go. He signed a $4.5 million contract this offseason as a free agent, an international free agent, only 25 years old, but he's somebody that was brought over with the intention of immediately joining the Padres major league pitching staff. It was given a guaranteed deal, a 2-year deal with a mutual option for a third. it just became apparent very early on in the spring that he was not the caliber of pitcher that they had projected and that his stuff was not translating to the majors the way they thought he would. That is why he had spent the first month of 2024 with their Double-A affiliate. He had not pitched in the majors for the Padres. And I'd say the underlying numbers at Double-A looked okay for Go, yet it sends a pretty strong message that a major league free agent signing of yours couldn't even crack the opening day roster or the April roster at all at any point and was rather staying down there. The Marlins took that off their hands because apparently that was part of the equation here. That in order to get that trio of prospects, that eating the rise money wasn't quite enough, and that this was furthering their commitments, their financial commitment in this complicated deal. So Go was on their 40-man roster initially, and he was pitching at AAA Jacksonville, but it's not like they were under any delusion that he was an impactful reliever. Otherwise, he would have been up in the majors at some point. So they kept him on the 40-man just in case the situation presented itself. As you've noticed back in April, the Marlins had this pretty constant churn in the mop-up role where their starting pitchers, they weren't going deep enough into games, or if they had some injuries, it's natural to call somebody up, have them pitch a game or two, and then send them back down, just like that. And in this case, the Marlins were fortunate where their rotation performed really well ever since the Arraez trade, going deep into games, and even their relievers, as this whole pitching staff has been on a heater for the past few weeks. So if somebody like Go was not needed, he was all right in AAA, but it was kind of the reverse situation of his Padres time. The surface level stats look good, just a 3.00 ERA and no home runs allowed. But what immediately jumps out is only 3 strikeouts in the 9 innings he pitched. Even in a tiny sample size, that is alarming that a 1 inning at a time reliever wasn't putting guys away on his own. Go has a relatively deep pitch mix, about 5 different pitches in there to varying extents. It's mostly his fastball and his cutter. His fastball average sits around 92 to 94 and maxes out at 96, and his cutter in the high 80s. He also has more conventional secondaries. He has a slider and a changeup and a curveball right there. But watching him pitch in Jacksonville, there's just not a standout pitch in that entire bunch. There's not a put-away pitch in there. And maybe he had some success against Double-A competition, but since coming over, even in this lower level compared to the majors, the lack of swing and miss was pretty jarring. And that made the Marlins comfortable at this point to squeeze him off the 40-man in order to bring in Anderson. And it's not necessarily in an admission that this random waiver wire guy, Shaun Anderson, is better than Go, but it's also the understanding that they don't have to choose one or the other. Anderson goes on their 40-man roster. With Go, he's now going through the waivers process, and he's going to go unclaimed, largely because of that contract. It was $4.5 million guaranteed. From this point forward, about $3.9 million still left. And no team is going to consciously take that off waivers because it is a negative asset. A few days from now, I expect him to clear waivers, and I expect him to be outrighted to AAA. Next year, his contract has him with all the privileges of a tenured major leaguer. But for this year in 2024, I don't think he has the option of electing free agency at this point. He'll stay in the organization right exactly where he was before in Jacksonville. It's just that he won't be on the 40-man roster. He'd have to earn his way back up, or an emergency would have to call for him to get selected at some point later this season, and that's still a possibility. It's just, it can sometimes be difficult to make that distinction between the players that are being valued for their talents and then the players that are being treated like assets. It can be a little uncomfortable. You got to feel for somebody like Go, who at the time of his signing just a few months ago, he probably had every intention that he was going to pitch in the majors at some point. And now, more so than ever, that is highly questionable because he's not even on the 40-man at this point. This does not mean that the Marlins had a change of heart regarding Go. It doesn't mean that they made a mistake in the Arraez trade, because in the first place, this is not somebody that they had any expectations for. This is not somebody who was really on the same side of the package as the prospects were, believe it or not. This was a deal where he was just being treated as an extension of the money that the Marlins were already covering in Arraez's contract and taking off of the Padres' books right here. And I'll say again, I think I regret not being a little bit clearer about that. That went into my reaction to the trade and why I didn't think it was a good deal from the Marlins' perspective. For all the money they took into account on Arraez's deal and in Go's, you'd think they'd be able to get more in return, or you'd think they would simply wait until deeper into the season to get a more compelling offer. And it was head scratching at the time why it is that Bendix insisted this deal was too good to pass up. It's still a long way to go on that to find out if it is. The reality is it's going to take years for that trade to really play out and for us to fully assess it. This move should not impact that assessment, not even a little bit. This has been Big Fish, Small Pod here on the Fish on First podcast channel, presented by MPT College Consulting. Thanks for listening and tuning in to all of our audio offerings right here. I have been Ely Sussman on this small pod with you. As always, go fish.